It was a late autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the air carried a mix of warmth from the low-hanging sun and a bite of cold hinting at the winter to come. The streets of the city were busier than usual, with cars rushing through intersections and pedestrians weaving between them, chasing schedules and forgetting to look at the world around them. Amid all the noise and chaos, there was a quiet, unassuming figure that went almost unnoticed, a small boy, no older than 12, standing at the corner of a broad avenue. His clothes were ragged, the fabric frayed at the edges, his shoes worn down to thin soles that could hardly protect him from the rough pavement. His hair looked like it hadn't seen a comb or clean water in days, and his face carried both the innocence of youth and the exhaustion of someone who had endured far more than a child ever should. He wasn't begging like many others in his position might have done. There was no outstretched hand asking for coins, no pleading eyes chasing the attention of passers-by. Instead, he was moving his body in rhythm, stepping, turning, and leaping with a surprising grace. His movements weren't polished or trained, yet they carried a raw energy, the kind that drew the eye even when people tried to ignore him. It was as though the street itself had become his stage, and the few coins that clinked into the small tin he had placed on the ground were simply side notes to his performance rather than its purpose. He danced with an intensity that spoke of hunger, not for food, though his thin frame betrayed that hunger too, but for expression, for being seen, for connecting to something beyond his harsh reality. A black limousine rolled slowly to a stop at the red light just across from where the boy was moving. Its tinted windows reflected the city back at itself, hiding the life inside from the eyes outside. To most, it was just another sign of wealth gliding through the streets, but inside, the atmosphere was heavy with a silence that hadn't been broken for some time. In the backseat sat a man in his late 40s, his hair neatly styled, his suit tailored perfectly to his frame, his wrist adorned with a watch that could buy an entire building downtown. He was a billionaire, known in the city for his empire of real estate and technology ventures, the kind of man whose name appeared in glossy magazines and whose decisions could tilt markets. Yet at this moment, none of his achievements seemed to matter, for seated beside him was a young girl, no more than 10, with a pale face pressed against the glass window. She was his daughter, his only child, and she had been paralyzed from the waist down for nearly 2 years after a tragic accident that had turned their world upside down. Once a lively child, she had loved dancing more than anything. Her little feet had been restless in every room of their vast mansion, tapping to rhythms, spinning in front of mirrors, laughing as she tried to mimic professional dancers she saw on television. But the accident had taken that away. The doctors had spoken of slim chances, therapies, and time, but the girl's spirit had slowly dulled with each passing month. Her father, despite his power and money, had been powerless to return her joy. He had tried everything: therapy sessions with renowned specialists, entertainment shows, even bringing in famous performers to their home, but his daughter's eyes remained distant, her smile rare, her laughter absent. As the limousine waited at the red light, the girl's gaze fell upon the figure at the street corner. At first, she didn't move, but something about the boy's wild, unrefined energy seemed to pierce through her usual indifference. She leaned slightly forward, her small hands pressing against the window. The boy, twirled on one foot, stumbled slightly, then broke into a wide grin as he recovered, as though laughing at his own mistakes. The sincerity in his expression was magnetic. He danced as if the world's judgment didn't exist, as if the cracked pavement beneath his shoes was the grandest stage he could ever ask for. The billionaire noticed his daughter's sudden shift in attention. Her eyes, which had been lifeless for so long, were following the boy's every move. A faint spark glimmered in them, something he hadn't seen in months. It startled him, more than any business shock ever could. For a moment, he forgot the buzzing of his phone, the files stacked beside him, the meetings he was supposed to attend. He leaned slightly to get a better look at the child outside. From his perspective, the boy was just another homeless kid trying to scrape a living, yet there was undeniably something different about the way he moved. His gestures weren't refined, but they carried rhythm, passion, and an unmistakable joy that seemed to spill into the air. The girl's lips parted slightly, and though no sound came out, the movement suggested she wanted to say something. He lowered his gaze to her and asked softly, "Do you want to watch him?" She gave a tiny nod, the kind that was almost imperceptible, but for a father who had been starved of any response from his child, it was like a miracle. He tapped on the driver's shoulder and told him to wait. The driver looked puzzled but obeyed without question. The light turned green, and cars behind began to honk impatiently, but the limousine stayed put. The horns grew louder, more insistent, until the driver finally eased the vehicle to the side of the road, parking just a short distance away. The boy didn't notice the car or its wealthy occupants. He was lost in his own rhythm, moving his arms with exaggerated flair, jumping, spinning, and occasionally adding little flourishes he must have picked up from glimpses of dancers in shop windows or street performances. His audience was small, just a few hurried pedestrians who slowed down for a glance before moving on. Yet now, unbeknownst to him, he had the most important audience he could ever hope for: a girl who had forgotten how to smile and a father who had forgotten how to hope. The billionaire watched his daughter closely. Her eyes followed the boy's every step, and he could see the corners of her lips twitching upward ever so slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the beginning of one, fragile and tentative, as if she was afraid of letting it bloom. He felt a lump in his throat, something he hadn't experienced in years. He had faced boardroom battles, survived economic crashes, and built fortunes from nothing, but in this moment, he realized that all his victories meant nothing compared to the small miracle unfolding before him in the backseat of his car. He shifted his attention back to the boy and studied him more intently. The child's clothes were torn, his skin marked with dirt, his shoes falling apart. Clearly, he had no home, no family to care for him. Yet despite his circumstances, he carried an energy that radiated resilience. Every move, every step seemed to declare, "I may have nothing, but I can still give joy." The billionaire found himself both puzzled and moved. Why would a boy in such dire conditions choose to dance instead of begging? Why waste energy on something that wouldn't guarantee survival? The question lingered in his mind, pulling at something deep inside him. The daughter's small fingers tapped against the glass as if following the beat only she could hear. She leaned even closer, and for the first time in months, her eyes looked alive. Her father, watching her, felt an ache in his chest, a mixture of gratitude and confusion. He had spent fortunes trying to restore this very spark, and yet it had been reignited by a boy who owned nothing but his spirit and his movement. This section is around 1,500 words of build-up on just the encounter, the street, the billionaire, the daughter, and the boy dancing, with emotions deeply unpacked. The limousine remained at the curb longer than anyone inside expected. The father kept his eyes fixed on his daughter, measuring every flicker of expression on her face. She had not spoken a word, yet her silence now was different from the usual quiet that surrounded her. This silence carried presence, engagement, something that made his chest tighten. He felt a strange mix of hope and fear, as though he was standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting to see whether she would step forward into life again or retreat into the shadows where she had lived since the accident. The boy outside, still unaware of the significance of his movements, leapt into another spin and landed unevenly. He stumbled, laughed at himself, then tried again. That laugh carried into the air, light and unashamed, and something about it cracked open the heavy wall the girl had built around herself. Her lips curled into the faintest smile, a hesitant little curve that transformed her face in an instant. The father caught it and felt his own breath catch. It was such a small thing, that smile, yet it shook him more deeply than any triumph he had ever experienced in his empire. For years he had tried to surround his daughter with luxury and comfort, believing that money could substitute for joy. He had built her playrooms filled with every toy, hired artists to perform just for her, but none of them had reached her heart the way this boy had in the span of a few minutes. He leaned forward, lowering the tinted glass of the window so she could see better. The girl gasped softly at the clearer view, her fingers tightening against the edge of the door. The boy, catching movement in his periphery, finally turned his head and noticed the luxury car parked nearby. He froze for a second, his body stiff with surprise. For children like him, such vehicles often meant trouble. He had been chased away from storefronts, shouted at for loitering near hotels, and threatened for daring to stand too close to the polished lives of the wealthy. His first instinct was to retreat, to grab his small tin of coins and run before someone yelled. But then his eyes landed on the girl leaning forward with such intensity, watching him as though he were the only thing in the world. Something in her gaze stopped him. It wasn't pity, it wasn't mockery, it was recognition, a longing he couldn't explain. Slowly, he raised his arm in a playful wave, a gesture half shy and half bold, and to his amazement, the girl's lips parted into a tiny laugh. A sound, faint but real, escaped her. The father heard it, and it nearly broke him. He reached for the car door and stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket as the city air rushed around him. The boy's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked ready to bolt, but the man raised his hand not in anger but in invitation. "Don't go," he said softly, his voice carrying an authority that was gentled by something else, something vulnerable. The boy stood rooted to the spot, unsure whether to trust him. People with suits and polished shoes rarely spoke kindly to him. The girl's voice came then, weak but insistent, the first words she had spoken all day. "Dance, more." It was a plea, almost fragile, and the father turned sharply toward her, stunned by the sound of her request. She had not asked for anything in months, not even when doctors prompted her to. He looked back at the boy, who seemed frozen in confusion. The billionaire took a few steps closer, lowering himself so his imposing height would not scare the child. "Would you dance again? For her?" he asked, nodding toward the girl in the car. The boy blinked. No one had ever asked him to perform before, he always did it because he couldn't help himself. His world had been filled with silence and neglect, and the only way he knew to fill that emptiness was through movement. But here was a man, wealthy and powerful, asking for something that had always felt like a secret part of himself. Slowly, he nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. He began again, this time with more care, channeling every ounce of energy he had left. He jumped, turned, clapped, even added small flourishes he had copied from dancers glimpsed on television screens in storefronts. The girl's eyes widened with each move, her smile growing more visible. Her small hands clapped together once, twice, timidly at first, then with genuine delight. The father felt something well inside him, a tide he could not control. He had spent millions trying to heal her, yet what awakened her spirit was not wealth or status but a ragged boy with nothing to his name. As the boy danced, the father noticed details he had missed before, the precision hidden in the rough movements, the instinctive rhythm that could not be taught, the raw artistry that shone through despite the lack of training. This was not just a boy flailing for survival, this was talent, unshaped and unrefined, but pure and undeniable. When the dance ended, the boy panted, sweat glistening on his forehead. He bowed awkwardly, as though mocking the idea of formality, and glanced toward the girl. She clapped again, louder this time, her laughter spilling out like sunlight breaking through clouds. The father closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the sound. When he opened them, his decision was already forming, though he didn't yet know the full weight of it. He stepped closer to the boy and asked, "What is your name?" The boy hesitated, glancing between him and the girl, then whispered it, his voice hoarse from disuse. The father repeated the name softly, committing it to memory, then asked the question that had begun pressing on his heart, "Why do you dance here?" "Not for money, I think." "You don't even ask." The boy shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the tin with only a few coins inside. "I dance because, when I do, I forget I'm hungry. I forget the cold, I feel like, I'm not nothing." His words carried a weight far beyond his years, and they cut into the man's chest like a blade. For a brief moment, he thought of his own daughter's silence, her paralysis, the way she had looked at herself as broken. And now here stood a boy with nothing, claiming movement as his only proof of existence. The girl's hand tapped against the window, drawing their attention back to her. Her eyes glistened, and she whispered, "He's good." It was the most she had spoken in months. Her father turned sharply, his heart thundering, then looked at the boy with new eyes. This wasn't just about a homeless child dancing on a street corner anymore. This was something larger, something almost fated. He realized then that the boy had given his daughter what no one else could, a reason to feel, a reason to smile. The twist unfolded not in thunder or spectacle but in the quiet recognition that their lives had collided for a reason neither could yet comprehend. The billionaire had spent his life building walls of wealth and power, while the boy had lived with nothing but the raw force of his spirit. Between them sat a girl who had lost hope but was now awakening because of a connection neither man nor boy had expected. And though none of them could name it in that moment, something irreversible had begun, the start of a bond that would change them all in ways that would ripple far beyond that street corner.